Hello again from Editing Cass, and welcome to part 2 of my Tarr video. The short version is this was intended to be one video, but it's not working out that way. So first part contained my review of the movie Tarr as well as a summary of the movie itself. And the second part is building on you having an understanding of the main plot points of what happens in Tarr. So if you've seen the movie, you're good to go. If you haven't seen the movie and part 1 is still mysteriously missing, feel free to sign up for my Patreon because I have an unlisted playlist of the chunks which have survived the bots just perfectly fine, intact. It's just they're in 5 or 6 pieces. So for as little as $1, you can see my intact recap of everything without having to do all these stupid editing changes to try to get it to appease the system. Anyways, that's enough talking. Let's get on to the discussion. Previously on Cass on Tarr. Hey, aspects of power portrayed in Tarr pretty accurately map onto academia as a whole. I must discuss. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Tarr is a movie where the details are given to you as puzzle pieces, and it's up to you how they fit together and what the assembled puzzle means. And in a mediascape where it seems like most movie or TV executives don't trust the viewers to understand things unless it's spelled out to them, a little mystery and ambiguity is personally an exciting prospect. There were a couple things that jumped out at me in this movie, as reflecting some of the situations or power dynamics that can arise in higher ed settings that I hadn't really seen explored before. The first big chunk to talk about are the parts that resonated from my experiences in higher ed. And those experiences may have led me to interpret things differently than others, but we'll get to that when it's time. From that, we'll go to a more broad look at the main character, particularly on how her view of herself clashes with reality and what happens as a consequence. After that, well, I don't have the props on hand to do the full conspiracy web board with red yarn, but there's so many things to talk about with this movie, so let the chapter markers be your guide. The classroom scene, or Justice for Max. We're going to start things off with the classroom scene I glossed over in the summary. We save this for now because I'm going to give you my interpretations as we go through it. That would have broken the more objective approach I tried to do earlier. So, I should share some context about my academic background, particularly if you're new. I have a PhD in cognitive psychology, and it was a hard-earned one. My advisor, Richard, was obstructive to the point that, for me to actually finish at all, I had to get him kicked off my committee. Kicking your advisor off your doctoral dissertation committee is really hard to do, and that whole experience has left me with some pretty spicy takes. I shared some of the stories I have from my time in grad school with some new friends, and shocked would be a good approximation of what their response was. I have interacted with plenty of professors who can be terribly charming in public and various kinds of awful in private. Richard was particularly adept at not crossing any obviously bad lines, but another professor I learned to steer clear of, Louis, was not. But hey, Louis's tenure was denied, in part because of undergrads reporting him for his abusive yelling, so that's something. As is probably true for anybody who's attended higher ed, I have had many interesting classroom experiences. In undergrad, my chem professor was incredibly proud of his terrible student reviews. Like, he had a little shrine set up outside his office with the best of the terrible reviews he'd been given. He would regularly single out students in a lecture hall of 100 to castigate them for sleeping during his boring-ass class. So I slept on the floor. Or, the most memorable incident, a couple students, both women, left class early when it became apparent there wasn't going to be a quiz that day. He followed them out. We caught up with the students a little bit later and we're like, what? And yeah, he had followed them all the way back to their dorm room, lecturing the entire way, and probably he only came back when they closed the door in his face, and they weren't sure he wasn't going to try to force it open or something. Weird shit, man. Why would you continue a lecture to 2 people instead of the rest of the class? As a grad student, I TA'd for Louis of the denied tenure for 1 semester for sensation and perception, which is a hard class, no doubt. It was my first semester as a grad student and Louis' first semester as a professor. I held study sessions before tests. One topic people will struggle with, no matter the skill of the teacher, is the principle of univariance. I never remember which corner. I have a video on it if you would like to try your luck at it. The only thing you need to know for this is it's critical for understanding how color vision works, and it's a beast to wrap your head around. At the study session, the students were panicking because the principal was on the first test, and he was a shiny new professor. There was no way to know what his test would be like, and no way to study previous versions of it. Prior to the study session, he let me see the test, which some professors do, some don't. I understand reasons for both. The principle of univariance wasn't on it at all, not even a multiple choice question. For whatever reason, Louis attended this study session. I didn't have anything prepared, so I was just answering whatever questions they had. Of course, we got to the principle of univariance, and I try explaining it a couple different ways, but it's not getting in. And I know how it is when anxiety just locks up your brain and nothing is going to happen. That's where these students were. It sucks, but I know it, and pushing them further was not going to help. And I was stuck because I knew it wasn't on the stupid test, and I'm trying to subtly hint that, you'll be okay, guys, but I can't say anything further because the professor is sitting right there. So in his infinite wisdom, what does he do? He stands up, comes to the front of the class, and singles out the most vocal of the students. Why don't you understand it? We went over this in class. It's so easy. Clearly you aren't trying hard enough. Antagonistic, blah, blah, blah. The student and his friends weren't having it, so they fired back. They weren't understanding it because he was a terrible teacher, and how dare he test them on something he can't even properly explain. Unsurprisingly, this escalated to a point where people are just yelling. Louis is in full smug asshole mode, and I'm just there. Scared little first-year grad student, unsure what to do. I know they're arguing over nothing, but I can't say that, and I can't break this up. Eventually, Louis leaves in a huff, and the students soon after. I actually chased the students that were most central in that down, and when I was sure that Louis was out of earshot, I just flat out told them, look, the principle of univariance isn't on the test. Study everything else, but that one thing is not on the test. It's fine. Spread the word. Oh, well, Louis may not be a university professor anymore. Last I heard, he's teaching high school math. Those poor kids. My point with these stories is I've seen some weird classroom dynamics play out. What can happen when a professor basically paints a target on one student and doesn't let up. So, let's get to this classroom scene. It opens on a small group of students playing something later described as atonally tense, being led by the student Max. Tarr interrupts to ask them,
"Why did you come to Juilliard?"
Being asked why I went to grad school seldom seemed like a friendly question. I'm sure other people who've been asked can probably agree. It generally seemed more like an attempt at covertly saying, "You don't belong here." Max answers that
It's the best music conservatory in the country.
her curiosity is not sated, and eventually gets them to answer that the person who inspired them was Sarah Chang, a Korean-American violinist who studied at Juilliard. She confirms Max is a violinist, and
I can see why you would choose to conduct a piece like this. Must be a familiar pleasure in presiding over a bed of strings that behave as if they're tuning.
there's some laughs from the stage, and Max laughs, although it seems like in a kind of disbelieving way. In isolation, playful banter about modern orchestral music is probably normal, maybe even expected. But with where this class scene eventually goes, Tarr's early antagonism can be spotted pretty early on. She calls the piece very
Au courant.
Hear me out. Throughout the film, Tarr sprinkles in $10 words or drops a non-English term. This is particularly true when she's in rehearsal with the orchestra in Berlin. But there's something about doing this in an educational setting that catches my attention. While in rehearsal in Berlin, speaking German makes absolute sense. An American character speaking English? Duh, it's what we do. Occasional French or Italian terms are bound to happen given the roots of classical music. It seems like she does it more in this scene than the others, barring the contextual things I just mentioned. I'm a bit tuned to when people drop in these more expensive words, partially because, for better or worse, I am driven to give the appearance of someone who knows things, and one way to do that is to absorb novel words when they pop up. Also, my background was, shall we say, humbler than what we saw of Tarr's in this film. For various reasons, including some bullying as a kid about it, I've generally tried to hide that information. One way to successfully do that is to be able to know these fancy culture things.
Nice dress.
Thanks. I bought it at Versace.
Coupled with that is that being able to be obtusely loquacious is generally seen as a marker of intelligence, rather than somebody being a poor communicator. But there's a flip side to this, and it seems like Tarr will be weaponizing as this continues, intentionally or not. These fancy pants words can alienate and exclude people, make them feel less than, especially if their background didn't provide them the same opportunities to pick up these words, like tutors or foreign au pairs. When combined with Tarr's many other verbal cuts like, "Why did you come here?" Max's eventual anger makes sense. After a remark about the composer's direction sounding like some Danish chef's reindeer recipe, she almost condescendingly asks,
It's exciting to play new music, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
then has Max take their seat. She asks the conducting class how many students are also studying composition. We can't see if Max is from the framing. Tarr calls on one of the other students, asking her what she thinks of the piece Max had been conducting.
It's pretty awesome. I mean, there's incredible atonal tension.
Tarr agrees with the tension part.
You can intellectually contemplate or masturbate about the felicity of the so-called atonal, but
Another jab at Max through their choice of piece, as well as dropping in felicity.
the important question here is, what are you conducting? What is the effect? What is it actually doing to me?
I didn't show the full clip of Bernstein's youth orchestra that was included towards the end of the movie, but this was part of his point. What is the intended feeling you're trying to get people to feel? So it's interesting to see the influences of Tarr's mentor in her attempt at teaching. The other thing I want to talk about here is Max's leg bounce. I've seen all sorts of discourse about it. Why they're doing it. Is it nervousness because of Tarr? And maybe. We don't know how Max generally vibes outside this scene. But allow me to raise an alternate explanation. I am married to a chronic leg bouncer. Chronic. If he doesn't get to do some sort of leg movement, he says the muscles start to burn. And if the stars align and we happen to be falling asleep with each other, I can tell when he starts to drift off to sleep because the leg movements just fade. Given my extensive experience observing leg bounces out in the wild, I'm going to hazard a guess that the actor doesn't naturally do this or fidget in this way. So it ends up looking a little forced. Because it is. I don't know if I'm going to keep this, but it's sort of like the difference between a dog panting and a cat panting, where the dog is just a natural thing that they're able to just oscillate, whereas cats, it's something that they have to force. And I just called my husband a dog. My sense is that Max was given this trait as a way to further get under Tarr's skin, as she is very much about calm composure when in public, and is not above forcing that on others.
No, thank you, Sebastian. They won't be necessary.
She says good music can come in many forms, from ornate to stripped down.
So long as it allows you to answer both those questions. Max. Come on, what do you think?
There is a room full of students, and she's again focusing on Max. Good teaching practices involve spreading your attention to as many students as is reasonably possible. In positive situations, this means that more people get to contribute to the learning experience. P.S. I also have a teaching certificate. As an instructor, you may find yourself with a super excited and engaged student, either because they are totally stoked about the material, or because they have a stick up their ass and are trying to look smarter than the professor. Teachers have to learn the skills to rein in both types of students. The former because you want more students to participate, not just the one who's very excited. And the latter, just to keep the class moving. I generally prefer not forcing participation, like calling on particular students to answer, because I personally hate that shit to no end. If I want to contribute, I'll let you know. But opinions about what best practices are here varies. What is generally agreed upon is you shouldn't do what Tarr is starting to do here. At best, the rest of the class is now substantially less engaged because it's clear it doesn't involve them. At worst, you are putting all of your negative attention onto this one student in front of the class.
When Anna Thorwald's daughter gave her master class, she said she was often influenced by the form.
And some other stuff. Pause. The composer of the piece they picked gave a masterclass they attended. Keep that in mind.
But I'm not sure she was interested per se in describing those actual sounds.
Very punct contrapunct.
I could be wrong, but That seems to be a music term, but still. At least things are still friendly? Tarr says the composer's intent was vague, and in the absence of that,
How do you, as a conductor, have a point of view about anything?
she adds that sometimes you will have to act as if there's intent and meaning in a piece that isn't there, but hopes that won't happen for them. This will become more clear as the scene continues, but it seems like she kind of has a bias against modern composers, who aren't necessarily coming from the same
musical grammar
as the giants. And while she's not explicitly saying it, it seems like an implication is that the piece Max picked is incomplete because it doesn't have those features.
Now is the time to conduct music that actually requires something of you.
Again, implying that Max's piece doesn't.
Music that everybody knows but will hear differently when you interpret it for them.
I would think that the students' time at school would be the time to play both sorts of pieces. Play the old familiar stuff as well as the new, more experimental pieces. Get experience in both in an environment where, if things go poorly, there's not major consequences. She means the more broad now, the current day and age. She doesn't explain why we need to focus on reinterpreting the classics instead of embracing new ones. Naturally, she has to take this back to Max.
Why not a Kyrie? Like something like Bach's Mass in B minor.
I'm not really into Bach.
She's asking them more pointed questions, somewhat asking them to defend something they probably didn't even think would have to be defended.
You're not into Bach. Oh, Max.
And then she asks them if they've read a particular book about Bach, they haven't, and how they absolutely need to read it because blah blah blah. She asks if they've ever played or conducted Bach.
Honestly, as a BIPOC, pangender person, I would say Bach's misogynistic life makes it kind of impossible for me to take his music seriously.
And that, dear viewer, is the line that fired up the discourse machine. Yeah, come here. Okay, jump. Good jump. Good jump. Nope. 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 That's your box. That's your box. Good job. My interpretation of this is that Max has been put into a difficult position. It's clear that Tarr is not going to stop hammering them about Bach, so they've basically got two options. One is to try and take the easy way out and just appease her. Whether Max means it or not, just say, look, you've convinced me. I'll read that book, I'll look into Bach, I'll conduct some Bach, and we'll see if my opinion changes, and hope to God she moves on. No one likes being grilled the way Max is in this situation, and it's totally understandable to just do what you can to make it stop. Even if it comes at the cost of feeling a little ugh about yourself. The other is to stand their ground, as Max did here. Stop giving the nice answer and just lay out the truth. Max can't relate to Bach for some pretty valid reasons. When confronted with that, some teachers will finally see that this isn't a point they're going to win, so in the interest of the class, if nothing else, it's time to move on. But Tarr is not one of those people, instead insisting that others come into line with her way of thinking. Given her treatment of other people in this movie, it's pretty in character for her. I've tried to show the line in its original context because to me it doesn't read as preachy or judgmental or anything. They are just saying their opinion on something after repeated questioning. It's not like they try to epically own her with their identity, shut her down, or say she's a monster for liking Bach, or on the flip side, act super triggered in the face of perceived oppression. They just gave their reason why they aren't that into Bach. Tarr wants to know what Max means by their reasons.
Didn't he sire like 20 kids?
Yes, that's documented. Along with a considerable amount of music.
And there it is. The homodoxy pervasive in Tarr's world. As long as a person is putting out good work, whatever is going on in their personal life doesn't matter. We saw this in one of her lunches with her mentor, Andres, and the exchange about Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer measured a man's intelligence against his sensitivity to noise.
Didn't he once also throw a woman down a flight of stairs?
Though it's unclear that this private and personal failing is at all relevant to his work.
She raised criticism against Schopenhauer, but was brought back into line. As possibly implied in the movie, Tarr may have gone along with this because it bought her the ability to manipulate and abuse women she was attracted to. Power corrupts. She pushes a little further about what Bach's music has to do with his
Prodigious skills in the marital bed.
but Max doesn't have a quick answer for her.
Sure. All right, whatever. That's your choice. I mean, after all, a soul selects her own society.
So dismissive. At that point, if I were Max, I would be feeling pretty crummy and would likely just tune out, maintaining some semblance of hope with the knowledge that this is a one-off thing. She's gone after this class, but at least she's moving on now, right? She talks about the cost of cutting out music based on criteria like that, but admits that many symphonies do just that as they
See it as their imperial right to curate for the cretins. So slippery as it is, there is some merit in examining Max's allergy.
What can I say but yikes? Tarr is very much letting her anger slip more and more into this, and she's keeping him very focused on Max. Although now she's othering them to the rest of the class, that they're going to pick apart their allergy. She continues this thought. Who gets to say if these dead white guys' music can
Exalt us.
She brings up Beethoven, if he's okay.
Because for me, as a U-Haul lesbian, I'm not too sure about old Ludwig.
I understand that reference. But isn't part of the joke that lesbians settle into committed relationships fast? You know, with the not non-consensually cheating on your partner? Her solution to her feelings on Beethoven is,
I face him, and I find myself nose to nose with his magnitude and inevitability.
this seems to be going back to the tension between the products of a person and their personal life. That for her, the balance tips so strongly because of Beethoven's body of work that whatever happened in his personal life is inconsequential. Charitably, it seems like she might be trying to model a path for Max. That she's a member of the LGBTQ community and she's able to put that aside, so Max just needs to learn to do the same.
Come on, Max, indulge me. Let's allow Bach a similar gaze.
And she sits down to play some Bach. Fun fact, Blanchett learned to play the piano pieces in the film, and my understanding is the included music is actually recorded live. She plays some Bach, talking very charmingly about how it could be played many different ways, even getting Max to laugh. But you have to get inside it to understand that.
It's a question. And an answer.
She talks about the importance of the question to listeners in Bach's composition, and
The big question for you is, what do you think, Max?
they again have two paths before them. Take the less confrontational path. Concede, at least outwardly, that all of this have made them reconsider Bach, and finally, maybe she can move on. Or stick to their guns. Tell her honestly what they think, even if she doesn't like or respect it, with the knowledge that it may mean they're the punching bag for the rest of class. This time probably to the tempo of Bach instead of Mozart. The bitter irony playing out here is she constantly wants her conductors to have an opinion they will defend. She said it to Francesca before this.
If you have any real interest in conducting, you need to be able to speak your mind.
And she's likely said it to everybody she's mentored, as it was probably taught to her. Something similar was part of my PhD training, that I need to be able to defend the conclusions I draw from the information I take in. But I hit a similar roadblock to Francesca. After a certain point, I wasn't willing to toe my advisor's line anymore, and I was effectively punished for it. But we'll get into that in the next section. For now, back to Max and his answer to the Bach question. And again, I am so sorry for the flurry of little pause extractions that are going to happen for this next scene, because rumor has it if you keep a clip under 9 seconds, you're okay, and this scene in its entirety is so much longer than that.
You play really well, but nowadays, white, male, cis composers, just not my thing.
Don't be so eager to be offended.
Who seems to be the more offended one here? The one who is calmly defending their opinion, or the one who is reacting harshly to the other daring to not agree with her? What she follows up with seems like something I'd expect off of Jordan Burnt Peterson's Twitter.
The narcissism of small differences leads to the most boring conformity.
That doesn't even make sense. How would paying attention to people's small differences lead to conformity? As a married white cis woman, it can almost be tempting to buy into the cultural belief the straight cis white normative society is selling. The differences are small. The minorities are getting all worked up about nothing. The status quo is fine. But even then, I've had enough experiences to know better, and Tarr should have too. Just on the woman front, even in easy mode. While things were going sideways with my advisor, the dean shared an opinion with me over lunch. My advisor's a misogynist. He can hide it pretty well, but it's there in the pattern of how he treats people, and it was quite possibly playing a role in how my dissertation process wasn't proceeding. Being treated differently than my male peers goes all the way back to elementary school for me. In a gifted class, we were supposed to do a project on a president, but wait, not you, Cass, the only girl in this class. You are doing it on a first lady. I was prepubescently livid about this, so quit gifted for a while.
Why the fudge was I being treated differently?
Tar's line about small differences leading to boring conformity does inform us a bit about her character. At this point, those small differences are irrelevant to her. It's possibly part of why she wanted to change the accordion fellowship mandate. Max tries to smooth things over by saying that,
I guess Edgar Varese is okay.
just to save you the Google, Eris was an early 1900s French composer who Wikipedia describes as the father of electronic music for his foresight in using electronics in music. But Tarr is not going to be appeased now.
Then you must be aware that Varese once famously stated that jazz was a Negro product exploited by the Jews.
Yeah, that's a real quote. And if Tarr wasn't saying this as part of a continued attack on Max, maybe they'd be able to receive what seems to be the core point here. Basically, everyone is problematic. Everyone has some form of yikes baggage attached. This could then be used to lay a discussion on what to do about that. How do conductors square the music against the bad stuff? It's certainly a problem for all of academia. How do we build off research from people who are kinda sus to outright harmful? But that's not where Tarr opts to go next.
The problem with enrolling yourself as an ultrasonic epistemic dissident is that if Bach's talent can be reduced to his gender, birth country, religion, sexuality, and so on, then so can yours.
Seems like she's extrapolating a lot from Max's opinion. That they didn't pick someone like Bach for this class performance means they are an ultrasonic epistemic dissident who's putting Bach's music in the no-touchy white misogynist box. I'm gonna guess they were given free choice on what to pick, so Max went with something from a woman composer who did a masterclass they enjoyed. I'd imagine the point of this class was probably to have Tarr give feedback on the students conducting. You know, the thing they're going to school for? Maybe share some of her wisdom and expertise in how she does it? Or try to work on points where the student's technique clunks. Not deride one student for not liking Bach. Something that wouldn't have even come up if she hadn't pushed the issue while losing sight of the class.
Someday, Max, when you go out into the world and you guest conduct for a major or minor orchestra...
Pause. Yet another dig at Max and now their ability. As shown throughout the movie, she seems to equate a person's talent and, dare I say, worth with where they are on the conducting hierarchy. The best people are the full conductors, with the lesser riffraff making up the guest or assistant conductors. Never mind that her Berlin position was secured only through political subterfuge with the help of her secret partner Sharon, along with more public support from Andres. And I've seen the same shit in academia. The real professors are the ones at the prestigious top universities, and below that are the professors at the schools that are technically R1 but nowhere near as prestigious, and then the professors at the smaller state schools, and then at the community colleges. Someone in my program wanted a lower key job so she could have life outside of work, but her advisor was not going to have that. His students were going to place well. So he went and did the networking and the elbow rubbing and the schmoozing to get her a good postdoc so she could get a better job. Because, despite what I was told in high school and undergrad, it always matters where you go to school. You have to make the exact right moves to move up the prestige hierarchy, and your pedigree will always be an anchor. As I was basically told by my advisor while applying for jobs. He outright told me not to apply to a couple of the fancier schools because that would be sending the wrong message. Yep. With that in mind, Max graduating from Juilliard would certainly open up some doors. Anyways, back to Tarr talking about the guest conducting she sees in Max's future. She says that the players they're leading will have rating sheets to rate them.
Now, what kind of criteria would you hope that they would use to do this? Your score reading and stick technique or something else?
Max says nothing. Can't say I blame them. Clearly annoyed by this, Tarr continues.
All right, everyone. Using Max's criteria, let's consider Max's thing. In this case, Anna Thorvaldsdottir.
Again, she's separating Max from the class, and they're even visually isolated behind the piano. It bears repeating. Max's thing is actually more Tarr's thing. Their personal preference is being blown up into them condemning artists for their traits. Bach's misogyny was the reason given when pushed by Tarr.
I would say Bach's misogynistic life makes it kind of impossible for me to take his music seriously.
Yeah, Bach's gender and ethnicity eventually came up, but much, much later.
White, male, cis composers, just not my thing.
She's strawmanning Max. That is not teaching praxis. But hey, at least we're somewhat back to what started everything, with the composer of the piece Max was leading. Tarr says there's two things that can be agreed upon for Anna Thorvaldsdottir? Or Anna Thorvaldsdottir.
One, that Anna was born in Iceland, and two, that she is, in a Waldorf teacher kind of way, a super hot young woman. Show of hands.
Nothing like the awkward compliance when put into a situation you have zero idea how to handle. Although, Ponytail in the front row seems to be enjoying things. At least she's having fun.
Now let's turn our gaze back to the piano bench up there and see if we can square how any of those things possibly relate to the person we see seated before us.
Cool. Now Max's purported thing is that a person can only interact with music when they have a direct one-to-one characteristic match with the composer. Of course that's an absurd point. A person can relate with and perform music by all sorts of artists. But there is an interesting discussion that could be had here about representation. Yeah, loads of people are familiar with music from the biggies, like Bach, Beethoven, Mahler, and anyone should be able to play their music. But what about the composers who were sidelined because they weren't white or male, like Mahler's wife Alma? Shouldn't her work receive attention too? And for all her emphasis on the individuals that got people into music, she seems to be continually surprised when it isn't a white man. Representation matters. But this was more of an unveiled attack against Max, and they reached their breaking point.
Where are you going?
Apparently, Max is supposed to just sit there and take the ceaseless pokes and prods and now bullying from her.
You a fucking bitch.
And you are a robot.
And while they walk out, Tarr continues on them about social media designing their soul. To be a conductor,
You gotta sublimate yourself, your ego, and yes, your identity. You must in fact stand in front of the public and God and obliterate yourself.
that last part doesn't sound particularly healthy. Obliterating yourself for your art and job on a regular basis. Although the publisher parish grind in academia is no better, really. Wear yourself down to dust trying to stay ahead of an ever-growing curve of publication output from people who would otherwise be your allies were it not for the competition over resources. Shit's fucked. Back to what she was saying, why does a conductor have to sublimate all of themselves to conduct? Why can't their choices or opinions be informed by their background? Does she even do this? We certainly saw her ego get the better of her in one instance. If all this Bach versus Thorvaldsdottir discussion had been framed in the context of future advice, and not exclusively targeting Max, it almost certainly wouldn't have gone so poorly. As said, I am a complete noob in this field, but I would guess that there's some job-acquiring benefit from being able to competently and comfortably lead compositions from people like Bach. There's more mainstream appeal there, which means there's probably more jobs. But there's also the counterweight of one's personal feelings towards those artists. I don't know if this analogy will quite map on, but a choice many an industry professional or academic has had to make is if they take Department of Defense money, either through DoD grants or through direct employment from companies like Raytheon. They love physicists. Being able to provide for yourself and your family versus the knowledge that you have some blood on your hands. Now, conducting music by dead white dudes isn't the same as making bombs more efficient, but I could see a conductor needing to figure out what's right for them. It may cost some job opportunities, but at least they haven't sacrificed a part of themselves to do it. And if you do that soul searching and you come to a conclusion your superior doesn't like, well, F's in the chat. I talked about this in more detail in a different video, but when I was nearing the end of my PhD, I was applying for professor jobs. And in the years that I was searching, a fair number of evangelical or more general Christian schools were hiring. Thing is, I'm an atheist, and these schools had honor codes or oaths or other things that the employees had to swear by, which included stuff about Jesus Christ being your personal Lord and Savior.
I'm bathed in his blood.
I'm bathed in his blood.
I'm bathed in his blood.
Bathed in his blood.
I'm bathed in his blood.
Bathed in his blood.
I couldn't apply to these jobs in good conscience. I'd either be living a lie or forced into hiding, hoping to God no one found out. My advisor did not like that one bit. He saw me not applying to somewhere between a quarter and a third of the potential openings and demanded I do it. I told him why I wasn't applying to those schools, and I'm not going to torture myself to see if I still have the email to get it verbatim, but he basically asked me if I'd rather be working or not have a job. Fuck me for having principles, I guess. And just another item on the stack of his growing displeasure with me. In my opinion, the scene showed Tarr targeting a student who wouldn't fall in line with her opinions, continuing to put pressure on them until they couldn't take it anymore, resulting in them leaving. While she may have raised some valid points, buried in other things, that doesn't make the entirety of what she said or her methods correct. That she bullied a student into leaving her class doesn't mean she won or that they lost. I've hopefully shown enough of it for you to make your own call. Certainly be interested in hearing those in the comments. But if you take a gander online at the discourse for this movie, it can feel like I'm in the minority, to the point where I almost scrapped this project entirely. The thing that saved it was finding an interview with writer-director Todd Field talking about this scene. What would your older self tell your younger self? This version of these two individuals, one is 50 years old, the other one is half that age, and the younger one is very much like Lydia Tar when she was 25 years old. She was breaking glass ceilings. She was ignoring the canon. She didn't care about dead white man music. The scene is triggered by her dismissing the choice of music from the student, and I think that was important for me. The person she's criticizing is female. She's younger. She's, as she would describe, quite beautiful. She's also heralded and as a very particular kind of modern composer. I think that's important. Why does she go after the student? Those are very personal reasons for her. She states them as being some sort of large pieces of wisdom, but the truth is she has an agenda. One is a dialogue between past and current Tarr, with her having changed into someone not fighting the system anymore. The other is that Max picked a composer that is essentially a younger version of what Tarr could have been had she not lost or sold her ideals in exchange for power. Food for thought, I suppose, but I would still be interested to hear what y'all have to say. Power dynamics. Tarr is, in part, a movie about power. We join her at a very high point in her career, right before one of her past actions catches up to her. And arguably, she only faced consequences for that because Krista herself came from a powerful family who could afford to take legal action after her death. One of the things that struck me about the power dynamics was that pretty much everybody in Tarr's life was tolerating the shady things she did. The depressingly realistic part was what was ultimately their breaking points. Tarr's employer, the orchestra, cut ties with her after the abuse allegations broke and caught traction. Sebastian, her subservient, only called her out on her shit when his position was threatened. Her wife's line didn't even seem to be the abuse itself, and more on that later, but the fact that Sharon had been excluded from the decision-making process. And finally, Francesca. Despite having access to a lot of damning information, she didn't act until she'd been snubbed for the assistant conducting spot. Now, in fairness to her character, it is possible that the coordination with legal didn't start until after Tarr told her the position was going to someone else. It's hard to say for certain with what's included in the movie. But to me, it seems like she could have been at least talking with the lawyers while waiting to see if Tarr picked her or not, and when she didn't is when she opened up with the information. At her last appearance in the movie is the scene where Tarr tells her the spot's going to someone else. Seems telling for this. The shitty thing is, at least from my experiences in higher ed, this is par for the course. People's bad behavior is overlooked, excused, or covered up because of the political inconvenience in addressing it. Louis of the denied tenure only actually had his tenure denied because the dean essentially did an executive order to block it. His tenure committee voted to approve, and more on that in a second. So the psych department voted to approve because he did the bare minimum required of him, which somehow didn't include not verbally abusing his students. So then the department heads voted to approve because it would raise a huge stink if they rejected it after the department approved it, and on, to eventually it ends up on the dean's desk, and she has to bear the brunt of the blowback for rejecting it. And she only really felt comfortable doing it because she had talked to his students, including his current grad student who felt like he had to walk away from his PhD afterwards. He had to basically sacrifice his dream to make sure that Louis wouldn't continue to get away with it. You want to know who was particularly salty about this decision, aside from the obvious? Richard, my advisor, chair of Louis' tenure committee. You want to know who put those students in contact with the dean? Yep. I don't know if Richard knew that, so I can't say for certain that factored into my difficulties with him on my dissertation. But I do know he was generally upset with me for not including Louis on my dissertation committee. For one, I wasn't doing his bro a solid, because committee membership can help with the tenure decision process, which he desperately needed. But also because I just wasn't doing what he wanted, and that may have been the greater offense. We see this with Tarr. Sebastian annoyed her, sure, but he also had differing opinions on how things were sounding. After having the idea of removing him opened up by Elliot, disagreeing with her was only fuel for the fire. Max dared to not like Bach in her presence and wouldn't budge. We don't know exactly what happened between Tarr and Krista, but something happened to cause Tarr to fuck her over so royally. And Francesca may have picked up some collateral damage from that falling out, but there are several story beats included of her discordance. Such a potent little word, discordant. Nothing like being called that by your advisor and having to Google it. Francesca pulled Tarr away from a doting fan. Francesca had a different opinion on the nature of Muller's relationship with Alma to Tarr's, which seemed to shut down Tarr's friendliness in the car ride. Francesca is very upset by Krista's death, while Tarr just wants to move past it. Francesca hadn't deleted the emails with Krista as Tarr had ordered her to. Now, these offenses weren't the only reason Tarr didn't pick Francesca to replace Sebastian. There very definitely were appearance reasons as well, as indicated by most everyone assuming the spot would be going to Francesca, but possibly because of personal affections as opposed to legitimate reasons. And she could have that, not while trying to start a relationship with Olga. All of that likely would have been overlooked by everyone were it not for the negative attention Tarr was getting after Krista's death. This is all too familiar for me. As mentioned earlier, my advisor had a bit of a reputation. In addition to the misogyny comment, the dean told me that he was known to be a bully, at least behind the scenes. Like in one notable instance, he strong-armed the department into hiring someone who was a worse fit and less qualified for a position, threatening that the cognitive program would walk unless they hired this particular woman for a neuro slot. Separate programs. The woman he got them to hire was younger and more conventionally attractive than their intended pick, and oh yeah, she just happened to be a former student of theirs and married to one of the other cognitive professors. Seriously, the dean and her close associates strongly advised their students steer clear of him, which was advice that had to be given because he was generally well liked by students who mostly interacted with him in class. His teaching persona was very friendly and charismatic and bubbly, which just wasn't his advising at all. Personality differences aside, it was a known problem in our program that his students didn't have the same publication numbers as the other students, but blame was always put at our feet. We weren't trying hard enough. We had to write more. We had to run more experiments. We had to up our efforts. When in reality, the other professors of the program regularly brought their students in on papers that they weren't really that involved with. It could even just be, here, write the methods for me, and I'll include you as an author, and you can get some experience with how this publishing thing goes. As opposed to only having students on papers for projects they initiated. Tied into that were drastically different approaches when it comes to co-authoring works. I was absolutely dumbfounded when I found out how much the other advisors actively wrote in their students' things, like papers or even theses. Richard's approach was just to flag something as being a problem and needing to be rewritten, even on things he was a co-author on. But were the other professors going to do anything about this? Of course not. For several of them, I'm sure part of it was Richard being on their promotion and tenure committee, so having a degree of power over them, but It also meant that their students would have slightly less competition for jobs. I wasn't kidding when I said I've got some spicy takes from all of this. Institutional inertia might only be overcome at the cost of people. Louis' tenure rejection specifically mentions his grad student in some of what was said, because the dean wouldn't have had enough cause otherwise. Tarr only suffered consequences after Krista took her life, and her family had the means to go after her for it. I was very, very close to similar action while trying to finish my PhD, solely because of Richard. If that had happened, I can't imagine he would have faced any serious scrutiny. I wouldn't put it past him to play up how disturbed and troubled I was, similar to what Tarr did to Krista. There were several meetings where I was in his office holding back a complete nervous breakdown until I could get back to my office. I know I can keep a strong front, but I know I have my limits, and I'm sure cracks were showing. Granted, we're talking completely different scopes, as my relationship with Richard was only professional. For all the shit I talk, I can credit him with never having a romantic relationship with a student, unlike some of the other professors there. So yeah, power dynamics. Who is Tarr? To say it again slightly differently, we're going to have to infer who Tarr is, in terms of who she thinks she is and who her actions say her to be, from what's included in the movie. These are going to be my interpretations, sometimes with some help from Todd Field, so if you guys walked away with a different impression, I would love to hear it. In the New Yorker interview towards the beginning of the movie, Tarr seems to have some tension with feminism or her herself being a feminist. Part of this can be captured by her saying her foundation had,
We've made our point.
It's time to open things up to all genders. Saying that the
Pauline conversion is, if not complete, then it's evolving nicely.
gives us something to work with. The Pauline conversion is, quote, any life-changing event in which one's views are significantly altered, with the originator having been the biblical Paul who worked to spread Christianity after having a spiritual experience with Jesus while persecuting early Christians. To call this still paltry number of women conductors evidence of a significant shift in hiring practices is laughable. It's never explicated, but I think part of her wanting to open up the accordion program may have been self-serving. That was some combination of reducing the odds of her being tempted by fellows, or, similar with Francesca, reducing the possibility of it looking like the program was just a mechanism to feed her new playthings. Tarr may have identified more as a feminist earlier in her career, when she was still having to fight her way into the positions she got. Her last conversation with Sharon hints at the degree she had to fight, that she was only able to pull it off thanks to her wife's behind-the-scenes help in successfully playing the politics just right. In my head, I include cozying up to Andrus as part of that, but that could have been separate. Another academic wrinkle occurs to me with that thought. In my experience, it's so important for women to not just have an advisor, but a mentor. Someone who, can advise them on what they should be doing, but also mentor them through the various things that come with the job. I'm sure this isn't just the case for women, but other groups new to the space. Gender, sexual orientation, or ethnic minorities, first-generation academics, just loads of people. I saw a huge difference in my cohort between those of us who were reinventing the grad school wheel through a combination of shitty advisors and being first-gen, and those whose parents were academics, or at least had the financial means to help support them, so they weren't having to worry about, how am I going to afford going to this conference, or pay for rent. Those small differences add up to huge stressors and missteps that are hard to recover from. Tarr seems to have had a solid mentor in Andrus, who helped her take on the full conductor mantle and all of its power, for better or worse. But having a solid mentor doesn't transitively or osmosize into being a good mentor. My advisor was certainly proof of that. As said earlier, I'm not sure what the norm is for apprentice mentors like Francesca, if Tarr was overextending their relationship and having her act as her personal assistant. And maybe that even is meant to be a red flag for things. That people knew Francesca was a fellow, but not saying anything about Tarr's use of her time. The shitty thing here is, from what little I knew about grad school, I was totally willing to go above and beyond like that for my advisor. The best I could figure was that having that kind of trust and access would mean that I was viewed as a valuable asset that would be assisted in progressing. Joke's on me, no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be that for my advisor. There was another student in the lab who started at the same time as me who came from a bigger school with a PhD program, so she knew more of what she was doing, worked with somebody who was known in the field, and had a brief stint in a military research lab. All valuable traits to my advisor. And the really sad thing is, I only gave up after that student graduated, and all of my efforts weren't bumping me into that vacant slot. Back on point, Tarr seems to me like a failed feminist or a fuck you got mine progressive. Earlier in her career, she was an exemplar of what progress could be. First a woman conductor, and then a lesbian conductor. But times have changed. Somewhat. God damn this fucking country. While white women are still fighting for equality, other groups who've had a harder time are becoming more able to fight on the same front. And, as shown by Max, they may be less willing to abide by the status quo to get there. And at that point in the movie, Tarr is effectively part of the status quo, as much as she may not want to acknowledge it. This is particularly true for how she has chosen to use her hard-earned power. Her gradual and casual discarding of Francesca probably reflects a trajectory for those who, similar to her, were willing to toe the line and deal with not being her chosen one as long as it ultimately got them what they wanted. After all, other former accordion fellows seem to have been placed well.
And honestly, we've had no real trouble successfully placing any of them.
Some may have been fine with the relationship they had with Tarr, and me saying that is not condoning this behavior. People in power should do some serious fucking soul searching before starting an intimate relationship with somebody under them. And also get rid of the power imbalance because that only seems to compound with time. That there were a number of women suggested as having talked to the Post would seem to indicate many weren't okay with the relationship, seeing as how the program was roughly 10 years old. But people weren't going to start speaking up on it until a crack in the dam appeared. Thanks to Krista. Not that I'm blaming them. We've already talked about some of the personal costs associated with bringing someone down. Speaking out in this manner about their former mentor could get them blacklisted in the industry. That's something that's brought so much silence about so many people for decades. Broadly speaking, though, it seems that Tarr's pretty comfortable using her power to get what she wants. She wants Sebastian gone? He's gone. She wants Olga to get the solo in the companion piece, so she can have more access to her. Olga gets a spot. She wants her daughter to not be bullied. She makes it happen. She is a corrupt power haver. A question I'm left with is whether or not she was corrupted by the power, or if it just enabled behavioral patterns that were already there. I could see the argument being raised that it doesn't really matter. The end result's the same. I still think it matters, though. Is everyone destined to abuse power if they're handed some, or can some wield it responsibly? In order for me to have some small measure of peace in the current hellscape we're occupying, I have to believe that power isn't absolutely corrupting. That there are some people in positions of power who are totally doing good, and not just enough good to offset the skeletons in their closet. Something else that can help inform us about Tarr are the relationships she has with her family. She seems very distant to her parents and brother, as demonstrated by not finding the time to visit her mom while in town, as well as the icy conversation with her brother.
But you don't seem to know where the hell you came from or where you're going.
The family she's built with Sharon also seems surprisingly distant, although I can't say how much of this is due to a class difference. Tarr's interactions with her daughters seem to be rather limited. I know this can be the case for people up the power hierarchy chain and can be seen as a necessary evil to support the family in their huge ass fucking house and fancy school for their kid, but it's still something that caught my attention. Like, if Petra were asked, would she rather have the time Tarr spent composing the piece dedicated to her is time actually just spent with her mom? Then there's her relationship with her wife, Sharon. The snippets we're shown of it feels somewhat impersonal for a married relationship, at least to me. And you know, maybe it mostly works for them. Sharon certainly seems to have made her peace with Tarr sleeping around.
There are many things I accept about you. And in the end, I'm sure I could get over something like this.
It's only when the betrayal included excluding Sharon from the decision-making process that a hard line was crossed. An absolutely fucked part of their relationship is Tarr stealing Sharon's medication, which I don't think Sharon came to realize during the film. Maybe she would have after Tarr got kicked out, as her medication would stay where she'd left it. Sharon's mother seems to not have much of a personable relationship with Tarr, or even potentially Petra. I had to look at the credits for the scene and see that she had the same last name as Sharon to realize that this was her mom and Tarr's mother-in-law, not an old-school babysitter. But As called out by Sharon, Tarr's only relationship that wasn't transactional in nature was with their daughter. That's bleak. There's one final part to the question, who is Tarr? And it's tied to the question of how much we can believe about her and her life. The most superficial part of this is her name. She was born Lydia Tar, but that's not what she's known as worldwide. This part is interesting, but honestly not terribly uncommon, even outside the YouTube space. I know a handful of people who are professionally known as something other than their birth name. Sometimes it's for reasons that were probably somewhat similar to Tarr's. A name shouldn't matter in publishing or hiring decisions, but it does. If you can polish up what you've got and improve your chances, there's nothing really stopping you from doing it. Nobody checks to make sure that your publishing name matches your birth certificate. Some people take on a different name as a matter of convenience because we're so good with non-English names, as shown by me in this video. Some people just have a nickname they prefer to their actual name, to the point of it functionally being their name, including in published works. So it is notable that Tarr, years ago, rebranded herself, possibly as an attempt to hide her less extravagant upbringing, but realistically, not too shocking. No, there is something far juicier suggested in the film. And it's not that Lydia...
I don't read reviews.
Never, really?
No.
Tarr actually reads and collects reviews. In the New Yorker interview, she mentions a couple terms she picked up from her
mentor, Leonard Bernstein. But if you could define one thing that Bernstein gave you, what would it be?
Kavanagh. It's the Hebrew word for attention to meaning or intent. But Lenny, he believed in teshuvah, the Talmudic power to reach back into time and transform the significance of one's past deeds.
I have a couple Jewish Discord members, so out of curiosity, I asked them how accurate these definitions were. The general consensus was that they were okay-ish, but not quite right, and put it down to the writer not being Jewish himself and possibly not consulting with anybody to make sure he got it more correct, which is entirely possible. But this movie is largely operating alongside our reality with actual people. Leonard Bernstein really did the youth orchestra stuff on TV and was active up until his death in 1990. October 14th, to be precise. We can grab Tarr's birthday from when she edited the New Yorker quote into her Wikipedia page, October 14th, 1972. That could be a nice little bit of symmetry on the writer's part, or it could be something more. People can fudge their birthdays to some extent, especially on something like Wikipedia. Tarr would have been 18 when Bernstein died. As I mentioned, he was active right up until the end, and in the last couple of years, he led an orchestral academy for young music students in northern Germany. Looking at what we can see of Tarr's wiki biography, it says she attended LaGuardia at 15 and at 18, something off-screen, ending in festival. It's possible this festival is Bernstein's, forgive me Germans, Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival, but if she joined at 18 in 1990, she would have missed Bernstein, whose last year with the Orchestral Academy was 1989. We are shown her extensive collection of VHS recordings, with the implication they are Bernstein's TV series, and in the part we're shown, he had a very friendly and personable vibe that seems to have deeply impacted Tarr. It seems like the puzzle pieces are suggesting that Bernstein never really mentored Tarr, especially to the point of familiarity she has with him.
One was Lenny.
She has a plethora of solid, verifiable credentials, like her PhD work with the Shibibo Kanibo, but there's just this piece that clunks, and it's one that seems important to people. We've seen high-profile instances of people fabricating credentials or background details, with it seeming like there's far more passing by without scrutiny. I can even propose an evolution of this sort of thing, at least for Tarr, based on my friend's experience with her awful ex. It starts with a granule of truth. My friend's ex, DL, was in a PhD counseling program for many years. However, he didn't finish before he left. My friend got a job and he moved with her with the intent to finish remotely, as I did. But he didn't. The writing wasn't really happening, his advisor stopped pushing, so it just kinda fizzled out. Cut to a couple years later with his shiny new job as a policeman. Yeah, seriously. And there's some work event, and my friend catches a conversation he's having with his fellow cop buddies, and it's PhD this, Dr. DL that. Weird. Later in private, he tried to explain it away as just a misunderstanding, and my friend pushed on like, why didn't you correct them? It's, I don't know. Good thing. So for Tarr, I could see this happening stepwise, where she's got this parasocial familiarity with him from the TV series, People mistaking that for her having actually been mentored by him and just not correcting it and eventually elaborating on it, especially as it helps build her credibility and importance. So then we end up in a situation where she's being interviewed, talking about Lenny and getting fundamental ideas slightly wrong. Granted, this could just be a whoopsie doodle on the writing end, but with how much attention is given to those tapes and what parts of her bio we get to see, I feel like the law of conservation of detail is tipping the scales towards this being deliberate. Now let's move on to the various odds and ends I want to explore. This movie has been taking up space in my brain for a little bit, and I fully intend to exercise it with this video, so let's start by asking, but who was phone? Or more accurately, whose phones are we shown the screens of, and who's chatting? The first conversation we're shown is right at the start. This appears to be on Tarr's ride to NYC for the New Yorker interview, presumably on Elliot's private jet. Given that Francesca was with her for this trip, it's probably a safe bet it's her and that she's the blue in this exchange. So who is Gray? I think it's Krista. She's been burned by Tarr at this point, so would have every reason to shit-talk her for being haunted by her actions, as well as asking Francesca if she still loves her. I also suspect the foot who helped select the album cover to emulate was Francesca's, as she was very involved in the process of seeing that cover be made a reality. The second phone conversation is also relatively easy. It's almost certainly Francesca talking with Krista. This is supported by Gray recognizing the significance of the room, as well as Krista showing up outside the hotel that night. Now we're getting into harder territory. This is during Tarr's book launch, which occurred after Francesca burned that bridge to turn over evidence in Chris's family's legal case. This phone seems to have a black case or body. I'd initially thought it was Olga, but her phone, as shown in the car ride to the book launch and her chatting with the person in the back, seems to not be black. Okay, well, this person seems to be sitting in the second row during the reading, slightly off from center. Going to the wide shot, we can probably narrow it down to a couple people, but aside from confirming it's not Francesca filming, I can't really say who would be having this conversation. Although Tarr apparently had enough hurt accordion fellows, it could be any number of people. And perhaps trying to figure this out is missing the intent of the exchange. That enough people are over Tarr's shit to have these sorts of chats, that it doesn't matter exactly who's talking. But seriously though, if anybody has any solid ideas here, I'd love to hear it. The many mirrors of herself. It seems like Tarr can be the harshest to people who reflect an aspect of herself. The student Max, with their use of a non-traditional composer in what seems to have been a simple class exercise, their owning of their identity, and willingness to essentially stand up to Tarr by not backing down from her continued pedagogical assault, may have reminded her of her younger self, as indicated by Todd Field. She may be haunted by her conscience, as discussed in the early phone conversation, but she might also be haunted by the more idealistic and anti-establishment person she had been. Max's leg bounce also seems to get under her skin, but more on that shortly. Francesca, she's a tricky one here. She could almost be seen as a transition between the progressive youth and the conservative adult. She's either temperamentally well suited to the various things Tarr asks of her, or has been well shaped into the role. She seems to be faithfully putting in her time with the understanding that she will be rewarded for it. She follows Tarr's party line, but is able to defend her own opinion when asked. And the way Tarr pays back her loyalty is to pass her over for a position most everyone assumed she would get as a matter of political convenience. Perhaps that's how things would have gone for Tarr had she not had the help of Sharon. Sebastian's weird little fetishes are brought up in conversation with Elliot.
Dead stock pencils he's seen on carry-on holding photographs, that sort of thing.
That's just sad.
But in getting her prepared for her album shoot, she has helped in picking which album cover she's going to emulate, has a matching suit tailored, lovingly picks a pencil from a cubby full of boxes, and has some theater seats staged in her apartment to practice the pose. The violin is calling the cello Woody. Sebastian's pen clicking drives her up the wall to the point of her stealing the pen, but she has her own nervous behaviors. OCD and media literacy. I just so happen to be lucky enough to have obsessive compulsive disorder tacked on as a fun little extra to my anxiety disorder. One of the more fun ways it manifests for me are specific numbers being safe and others leading to certain doom for me and mine. Like, the car's radio volume has to be set on certain numbers, Otherwise, we're going to get in a horrific car accident, or the house is going to catch fire, or some other horrible thing that isn't at all related to the volume loudness in the car. Absurd, I know. My dad was a checker. Our summary tour of KOAs was inevitably delayed by at least an hour every year because my dad had to go back through the house, make sure everything was turned off or unplugged, because if he didn't, the house would catch fire. And then when that was okay, he would have to lock the door and recheck it, check it again, because if he didn't, a robber would break in and kill the cats. Tarr seems to have some stereotype behaviors she does mostly in private. The one most visually noticeable is a sort of air cleaning. She does it before the New Yorker interview, while in her apartment working on a piece of the piano, quite possibly while she's getting ready to launch her conducting coup, and while walking to the stage in the Philippines. Although, I will note that the second instance comes after passing by what may be her Krista haunting in the apartment. Tarr also makes judicious use of hand sanitizer, which, when combined with how a particular scene plays out, reminds me of my own contamination-centered OCD. So the way it works for me is I can feel like some space or some object is contaminated, and so I have to do something to make sure that the contaminant is contained. In early lockdown, this was relatively easy for me with COVID because I just didn't leave our apartment for several months. Can't get contaminated if I don't leave a safe airspace. Groceries or other supplies would go through a quarantine process where they just sat by the front door for a couple days, and if they were perishable, they would get a thorough Lysoling before they went in the fridge. It's not always so easy. I will clean myself raw if I feel like I'm contaminated by something, and the fucky part is that can include cleaning products like bleach. Part of that is because of the smell contamination. Bleach is no bueno, but another bad one for me is cigarette smoke. We've lived in a couple apartments that shared a wall or a floor with smokers, and my poor husband, the lengths he's gone to try to make me more comfortable. So I feel like if the smell's there, then the smoke is there, and the smoke is contaminating everything with the smell and the ashiness. My hair, my clothes, my skin, the bedding, the chairs, the cats, just everything. That bothers me on a cellular level. I have to make it stop. If I can't get the neighbor to abide by the complex's rules, either directly by asking them or failing that involving management, then I will just start bagging everything in airtight bags and Febrezing the shit out of everything else. Not the cats. The last place we lived before moving to California, our neighbor was an in-unit smoker, which was against the apartment policy. He swore up and down to them that he wasn't doing it. It was just coming in with him from outside, but he was doing it. We dragged them to our apartment a couple times when it was pouring in through the walls, because it literally was through the gaps in the walls, to say like, look, he's smoking in his apartment. Do something. Mind you, this place was Gap City in general. Like when it rained, water would come in through the exterior doors. It was that bad. And management wasn't going to do anything, so my husband taped up all of the holes on that wall we shared with this guy. And it helped somewhat, so we basically worked to increase the air pressure in our apartment to try to keep his air from getting in. It was all ludicrous effort for something I think most people are able to brush off relatively easily, or at least not feel contaminated when they encounter smoke. So, the scene I'm referring to is one I didn't show earlier for fear of the mighty content bots. But we're deep enough in this video, let's try. I can always blur it, right? This is after Francesca's left, and after her wife angrily leaves the car because of her erratic driving. Tarr is sleeping in her apartment. She's woken up from a dream involving Francesca by her neighbor, desperate for help. Tarr seems to be overwhelmed by the smell coming out of the apartment, but is convinced to help her neighbor get her mom back on her chair. This requires some direct physical contact with her mother, who is definitely not doing well. With the mom back on the chair, Tarr books it back to her apartment, throws the shirt she was wearing in the trash, and starts frantically washing herself in the sink. She's only broken from this cycle by Olga showing up for rehearsal. From my experiences, Tarr's actions easily read as her trying to get rid of the contamination she picked up in the neighbor's apartment. But I came across a different reading of that scene attached to a pretty different interpretation of the movie on a whole. And hey, upside of being a channel my size is I can't be accused of punching down when they're larger than me. So, The Oscar expert had this interpretation of that scene.
And there's this moment where she goes next door because her neighbor calls her for help to help this old woman up who's fallen out of her chair, and it smells like shit in this apartment, and that really disturbs her. It's like her greatest fear is just being helpless on the floor, not being able to control your own smell. Like when she gets back to the apartment, she's just furiously scrubbing herself down. That loss of control is her nightmare.
It's amazing the wildly different interpretations we have of that scene, but there's other points from this review that have me wondering what movie they watched.
When Tarr comes home in the beginning of the movie, we see her immediately solve two problems going on at home. One is where she finds her wife's pill that's been like distressing her. Like immediately she finds it, she gives it to her.
When I watched the movie, I thought it was pretty transparently obvious that Tarr found, huge air quotes, the pill for Sharon from Tarr's stash, and that Sharon had been unable to find her medication because Tarr had taken it with her. She hadn't solved a problem. She sort of fixed a problem that she had directly caused through her actions. Now, Todd Field is very happy to have people make their own interpretations, that it isn't his place to tell them what the different things mean, but some things are open for interpretation and some things are just wrong. As I said though, we aren't given explicit insight into the whys of Tarr's actions. The Oscar expert could be closer to correct in that the elderly woman in poor health was triggering fears of a loss of control. I feel like the repeated inclusion of her hand sanitizer use points more towards the contamination idea. Plus, it kind of matches what my gut reaction is when confronted with that scene. I would need to deeply cleanse myself and everything that was in that space afterwards. It has nothing to do with control. It has nothing to do with disgust for the lower classes or the inevitability of her parents' and partners' decline, as suggested by someone in their comment section. But again, those are my opinions. We don't know why she did what she did. We can only infer. So again, watch the movie for yourself and see what you get from it. Death of the artist. I think an idea explored more fully in Tarr than cancel culture is death of the artist. How do we reconcile the shitty to despicable acts of some artists who created some culturally significant works? Is there even reconciliation to be had? Tarr obviously benefits from separating the art from the artist, as her actions have absolutely tarnished her reputation from Chris's death onward, to say nothing of how her work will be interpreted in the wake of that. In the New Yorker interview, she referred to a concept Lenny believed in, teshuvah, described as being able to transform the significance of past deeds. Misunderstandings aside, the interesting thing here is it can work both ways. Horrible past actions can be transformed by later good ones, but beautiful music can be transformed by abuse allegations. This is an idea explored by fellow YouTuber Jose regarding The Cosby Show, a TV show staple of many a millennial's childhood. The nostalgic joy and comfort has been tainted by knowledge of what the creative force behind it did to women. That transformation of past works by a creator's misdeeds is, I think, an important part of the discussion of that creative work. Schopenhauer de-stairzonating a woman should factor into discussions of his philosophical contributions. Mahler's treatment of Alma is important in understanding those works. And to borrow one from science, there seems to be reason to believe Schrödinger of the cat box thought experiment was a person who was overly familiar with young girls. These extra details provide some context surrounding the work. Sometimes the work stands on its own even with that context, but I think more often than not, the added context helps inform a more well-rounded understanding of the work. I'm not saying that the entirety of the discussion should be centered on topics of this nature, and I'm also not sure where the line should be between important information to critically look at a work versus unrelated minutiae that can lead to armchair psychoanalyzing things into oblivion. Rebirth of the artist. Let's wrap this up where the movie wraps things up. Tarr filling in the Philippines. If I'm putting things together correctly, she ended up there as a result of the fan convention needing somebody to conduct stuff and Cammie allocating her talents there. The question for me here is if she experienced her own Pauline conversion as a consequence of what happened in the course of this film. She certainly went through some life-changing events, but was it enough to alter her views? She seems to still take the work seriously, approaching the Monster Hunter video game score with the same attention to intent as she gave to Mahler.
Now, before we begin, let's talk a bit about the composer's intent with this piece and what you might be after.
Her poise is as confident on stage, and her pill bottle and self-soothing also join hers before. I think the thing that, if it doesn't determine a person's interpretation of the ending, it certainly seems to correlate with, is how someone understands the scene at the massage parlor, which ends with her rushing out to vomit on the street. Was it a visceral reaction at finally realizing the situation she found herself in? Was it from understanding that her reputation was so well known at this point that the hotel guy would send her here for a massage? Was it a backlog of guilt for sexually abusing the accordion fellows hitting her all at once? I don't know. That such a low moment comes in the middle of her trying to relaunch her conducting career seems important, but I can't quite put my finger on why. Of course, the question could be asked if this is even really a relaunch, or her just trying to cling to relevance by taking any job. Although, the narration from the game that accompanies the music is directed to the members of the Fifth Fleet.
Once you board this ship, there's no turning back. The next ground your feet touch will be that of the new world. If any of you have lost your nerve, then step away now and let no one judge you.
This could be suggesting that she hasn't lost her nerve. She will continue in this new world she's found herself in. I would hope, having learned from an incredibly expensive experience, to not take advantage of those under you, but, well, if she's experiencing any guilt about what happened to Krista, and not just the impacts it had on her life, we aren't shown it. What a cheerful note to end on. Bye.